last but not least, from Broward County, we do have Alicia, and Alicia has been an amazing powerhouse this year. She works at an alternative center school, and those are always challenging. And we have some amazing teachers that, as the comments said earlier, it takes a village, Aloria, and the village definitely finds its way to Alicia's school, because I don't want to say the village sometimes gets a little thin, but it's the support needs to be stronger for our students who are at greatest risk and have highest needs. And thank goodness they have a guidance counselor in Alicia. So go ahead, Alicia.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to let everybody know how proud I am of all of your presentations so far. Sarah's actually really segues into mine, because mine is also about testing, and I will share my screen in a moment. I just wanted to thank President Fusco for believing in me and having me take part in this group this year. It has had such a positive impact on my life. The group that we have, I've really developed some strong relationships, and I gotta say, being with like-minded people has boosted my self-esteem and passion for what we do. So I just want to thank you again for this opportunity. I decided to join Rick Reese on the beach today, if you couldn't tell. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen, and I hope it, oops. Oh, yeah. Okay, here we go. Okay, can you see my presentation? Okay, fantastic. All right. Okay, so like Sarah, I chose to discuss standardized testing, but I wanted to research the impact that standardized testing has on students with disabilities. Now, this is a cause that's very near and dear to my heart, because as Ms. Pierpont shared, I work at an EBD, Emotionally Behaviorally Disabled Center, with grades K through 12. So I'm exposed to all of the tests that the students need to take. I've been with the county for 17 years. My first 3 years were at a mainstream elementary school, and the last 14 years have been at Cross Creek Center School for students with EBD. So I've been very familiar with the tests that the students need to take, especially the ESE population. So that's what I decided to focus my research on for this project. So what impact does standardized testing have on students with disabilities? I do have a lot of data in my slides, which again, I won't read, just like Janae said, but it's helping keep me focused on exactly what I'm talking about. So I'm just going to speak to these slides. So in the state of Florida, at least, students with disabilities, the SWD will always relate to students with disabilities. They are considered ESE students, exceptional student education. So they're mandated to take all of these standardized tests as their same peers, non-disabled peers. Scores may be waived for high school graduation requirements. So what I find in my center school, because again, I have K through 12, grades 9 through 12, the test that they must take in order to meet graduation requirements is all the end of course exams, the geometry, algebra, US history, biology, and also the Florida Standard Assessment, which is the reading and the writing component. In years past, those scores used to be standalone. They didn't have reading and writing together as one score. And also the writing was only given in grades 4, 8, and 10. So when we got rid of FCAT and brought in FSA, now that means all students in grades 4 through 10 are required to do the writing exam. So the Florida State Statute 1000.822 shows that all students, regardless of disability, are required to take these standardized tests. And again, you can waive it in high school. Is that an impact? Is that something that helps our students? And I'll get into that some more. What about grades 3 through 5? You cannot waive a score in grades 3 through 5. They must pass the FSA in grades 3 through 5 or a battery of alternative assessments. So if a student in grade 3, they're required to pass the reading FSA to be promoted. In grades 4 and 5, they're required to pass the reading and math FSA. So to me, it feels like there's more pressure on the younger ones to be able to accomplish and meet the assessment criteria to pass the FSA. And that's what I'm saying. So they must take these tests and pass them in order to be promoted. So the high stakes effects on ESE students has more of an impact even on the younger ones than it does with the high school students. So it's kind of sad, but I wanted to include this quote. Dr. Seuss had to weigh in on standardized testing. All schools for miles and miles around must take a special test to see who's learning such and such, to see which school's the best. If our small school does not do well, then it will be torn down and you will have to go to school injury Floggertown. Hooray for dip into our day. So I remember when I was working with elementary students, we used to have this program. It was called Bud and Dud, and it was really cute and the kids really enjoyed it. It was all about character traits and what would you do if you were Bud? And it was positive. What would you do if you were Dud? They actually had a test prep part of their program. And I know it was designed to inspire the students and to give them more self-esteem and belief that they could do well. What I found is that the littles, it just provided more stress to them. And it was really, really sad to see. I'll get into more about my personal experience with testing ESE students. So my question, does policy 1000.822, which is the Florida state statute, does it cause undue stress to students with disabilities and their families? One of the major concerns as far as testing any student, but especially ESE students that have learning disabilities, cognitive disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and for my setting, emotionally behavioral disabilities. All students have experienced test anxiety, but for students that have a disability, it is even more. It makes them even more anxious. And so I did quote a few things to speak to what test anxiety is. And according to the International Journal of Education Research, anxiety is defined as a basic human emotion, signaling a lack of self-assurance or a sense of threat coming from the environment, and is considered one of the most common reactions to stress. It puts you in that fight or flight moment. That's what stress brings on. And that chemical cortisol is what surges when you are anxious. So we're putting a test in front of an ESE student who has disabilities and does not have the same level of coping that a mainstream gen ed student would have. We're still, because of that law, putting these tests in front of these students and expecting them to have the same results as their non-disabled peers. And I wrote a little bit more about the characteristics of anxiety: an uneasy sensation that includes an undefined threat. Anxiety can be connected to expectation of physical injury, reduction in self-esteem, or diminished well-being. So we're putting these tests in front of these students where there is research on what the effect can have. And the last one says it's a defined sense of inability to have organized thinking or to remember material at the time of a test, tension and difficulty in reading and understanding simple sentences. In extreme situations, there's feelings of nausea, sweat, blushing, or a higher heart rate. I remember as an adult when I had to go in and take the GRE for my master's program, I remember experiencing these feelings. As a 22, 23, whatever I was when I had to take the GRE without a disability, I know the emotions and stress that I went through. So to see these children, especially in the younger grades, go through, when I watch them testing and I think about how I felt and I watch them go through that, I find that unacceptable. I find it cruel. I don't find it as, and in my research, I will show as well, it is not an effective way to measure student knowledge on these standards. So the way they kind of soften the blow, students with disabilities are mandated to take these standardized tests, but by law must be offered accommodations based on their IEP. So I listed a few of the accommodations that are available to students, and the accommodations must be accommodations that are provided in the classroom on a regular basis. So some of them, extra time, oral presentation of non-reading items. And that actually goes back to Sarah's presentation where they show the math questions, and most of them are a lot of word problems and reading requirement. So one of the accommodations, if they have it on their IEP, not all students do, is oral presentation of non-reading items. The way that works is, and we know that the tests, especially the paper-based, probably the computer too, those test questions are not the same on each test. So it's the fifth grade, let's say it's the fifth grade math test. Not all fifth graders are going to have the same booklet where the questions are in the same order, which is understandable to keep from cheating or inaccurate results. However, prior to, we have a text-to-speech thing now that they can use on the computer-based, but on a paper-based test, the teacher or proctor actually has to read the questions, which is a good thing. It's good that these students that have the accommodation to be read to. But what that does, even in a small setting, is that means that the teacher or proctor must sit with the student and whisper when they read the answer choices. And they also have to be very, very careful the way that they do that because of the penalties. And like Sarah said, you have to basically sign your life away to give this test. You have to put in your certificate number. They warn you that there's a penalty of law up to a fine or imprisonment. So even well-meaning educators that are just trying to follow the law, support the students, are under a lot of pressure to make sure that they are providing these accommodations with integrity. I've never seen a teacher that tries to inaccurately, give the students a higher level on the playing field to be able to, succeed. So I said, while helpful, do any of these accommodations assist with anxiety? The accommodations, small group, one-to-one testing, while that can give the student a feeling of more support, does it actually counteract the harmful effects of testing? And do these accommodations protect students who have emotional disabilities? I have my personal experience. I've been a testing coordinator for 17 years, so I've seen it all. Let me go to the next one. So the accommodations are meant to give the ESE students the equal opportunity while taking standardized tests as their non-disabled peers. So I did look up some data as far as, are these accommodations truly supporting to give them that level playing field? So in talking about some of the accommodations, extra time is one of them. So if their IEP says it goes where they have 150% of time, so they have time and a half. They have 200%, so they have double time. Some is, no time cap, where they are given the opportunity to complete that test in as much time as they need. It all must be in one day. How is this extra time truly helping our students? Do students actually utilize it? And in my experience, we always work with the students with disabilities ahead of time to make sure that they are informed of the accommodations that are allowable to them. We encourage them to make use of that time if they have extra time. We encourage them to allow the test to be read to them within law. And now with the computer-based testing, there's a new text-to-speech tool. And some of the teachers have reported it, and I've heard it myself, because some students, they don't always plug the earbuds in when they're supposed to. And I've heard this text-to-speech, and teachers have reported it is in a robotic voice, leaving the students baffled and unable to answer the test questions. So as they're looking at that non-reading item, because they're not allowed to have the reading passages read to them, But when it is a math question, like we saw in Sarah's presentation, when it's how many packets of markers do these teachers have, the students, it's not a voice they're used to hearing. It's not a voice that really makes sense to them. So to have that accommodation provided, how much does that really help the student? The student is already feeling behind and already feeling that they may not have success. So providing that accommodation, it's hard to find and see if that's really helping students. And one of the major issues with the accommodations, students do not always want to utilize them because they find them embarrassing. I've had students, we tried to group them in groups where they're allowed to be read to. And many of the students, when the teacher or the test administrator lets them know, okay, you have the opportunity to be read to, they don't want to be read to because they don't want to appear that they need that. They want to look like the other students that are able to read the questions themselves and answer the questions themselves without accommodation. On their IEP, I had a few students that had one-to-one testing, which is supposed to obviously provide them more support and allow them to test with a trusted adult. Many of the students reported, and these are elementary, middle, and high school students who said, oh, I don't want to do that. I want to test with my group. So the accommodations that are meant to protect the students do not always do that. They do not always give them the assistance that they need. Many of the students look at them as punitive, look at them as something to be embarrassed about, and they don't want to utilize that extra time. When the first question, because I'm not only the test coordinator, but I'm also, I will administer the test. And when I get to that manual and you have to read the script verbatim, and it's very dry, but legally we must read that script verbatim. You can see the students kind of rolling their eyes and not listening and putting their heads down. And many of them, Ms. Jaramillo, do you have to read this to me every time? And I explain, yes, I must do that per the law. I must read this to you. And the students check out before they even begin because they hear these, these directions in the manual, and to them, and I understand the reason for that is for the standardized part. So that, and I always explain to them, I try to, calm them, and I say, listen, every student in the state of Florida right this moment is listening to these same directions. And the reason for that is because every student must have the same experience while taking this test. And I kind of have to eat my words with that because I'm thinking, not every student's going to, have the same exact experience. They may be read the same script, but especially students with disabilities, they're perceiving things in all different ways. Some of the students with learning disabilities, and then the cognitive disabilities, especially the emotionally behavioral disabilities. These directions kind of go right over their head. I think I've seen it put more stress on students before they even begin. And many of them, as the directions are being read, I need to use the restroom. Can I go get water? They just want to get away from it. So I don't find those directions very, very helpful because our students, our ESE students do not have the same exact, like I said, the same experience. So hearing the same thing, I understand it, but I don't feel that it's very effective. So I'm going to discuss my personal experiences. I've been the testing coordinator for 2 different schools in Broward County for the past 17 years. My first 3 years was in a mainstream gen ed setting in an elementary school. The last 14 years has been at Cross Creek School EBD Center. So even when I was the testing coordinator in the mainstream gen ed setting, I immediately saw the stress and anxiety that the students went through, and not only the students, but the parents. As soon as we would get to testing time, that's when the nerves and the anxiety and the pressure was high, not only on the students and parents, but on the staff. As Sarah had put out there, is that, yes, the testing scores for the school are tied to teacher pay, are tied to school grade, are tied to our evaluations. So as much as adults, we want to lead our students with confidence and we don't want to put extra pressure on them. They do know about it. They do see it. And as much as we try to appear confident and instill confidence in them, we're human beings. And that stress, as much as we try to mask it, it is still present, and the students see that. I have witnessed the stress and anxiety before, during, and after testing. So it's not just while they're sitting there doing their test. Prior to, we have to send out the calendar to all parents to show what assessments they're taking, what is the date and time, and also what location are they in as far as testing rooms. So what I try to do with my EBD students is I try to group them, and I have a meeting with all of the teachers. We also have family counselor therapists on staff. Each student is assigned a therapist. So in order to create the most conducive testing environment, we meet together to try to find, okay, we look at the IEPs, they all have accommodations. So we try to schedule them based on the accommodations that they receive. What we find is, not to be a Debbie Downer, but what we find is as we're trying to create this conducive environment, we run into struggles because we may have students that have just had a major incident together, where there's students who maybe haven't been present, speaking back to the attendance. So trying to find that perfect grouping is very tough. I'm sure in all settings, but especially in my setting with the EBD population. When I was in elementary, Sarah just said it, I had a student vomit on her test booklet, and it was a gen ed student, just a third grade gen ed student. And her stress, started, of course, as the manual was, the test booklet was provided to the student, but I could see all the prep, the parents, because I spoke to the parent prior to, all of the stress the parent was putting on the student, not intentionally, the parent just wanted the student to be successful. But the little girl, third grade, literally vomited on her test booklet. So I had to go find the legal procedure for dealing with that situation, because the test booklet had already been opened, and there's rules that if the student already began the test and cannot continue, it must be invalidated. So I had to go research while this little girl was in the clinic. I had to go research, okay, she opened the book already. Can she get another booklet? How does this work? Because there's all these laws attached to it. So it was kind of sad. In the testing coordinator manual, it had a procedure on how to handle a soiled test booklet. I'm not quite sure what they meant by soiled, as though, did it drop in the dirt? Was there a footprint on it? But vomiting was actually listed. And what you're to do is take that test booklet, seal it in a Ziploc bag, and return it with the other materials, because it is a secure material. So, I was able to do that and provide her with another test booklet. And unfortunately, based on the rules as far as where the students were placed, because you have to do a seating chart, you have to show exactly where the student tested. I had to put that little girl back in her classroom to take the test, even though the other students had begun, even though, they all saw the poor thing vomit on her test. Now she had to go and take this test and do her best. That was upsetting. The test invalidations, there is very specific descriptions in the book of what test invalidations look like. We know that we have the sign we have to put up that if they take out a cell phone, there's many ways that it's an automatic invalidation. So at my setting, we try to be a little more forgiving while following the law, to help our EBD students, because some of them, just whip the test booklet across the room. Is that an invalidation, or are we allowed to go pick that test booklet up and try to get the student to test? We find that behaviors prior to and during testing become even more. The data shows at my school, as far as behavioral incidents, they run high right before and during testing, after testing as well, because the students that actually are sitting and doing the test, their pressure and their stress becomes so high that when it's over, they just want to flee the room and they just want to get back to what they were doing. And as I know, students, especially EBD, they would prefer to appear as bad than stupid. Nobody calls our students stupid. That's not something we would ever say, but in their minds, they feel stupid because they look at this test, it's Greek to them, and they would prefer to act out and misbehave rather than appear that they're not prepared or they can't do this. So that's why I feel we see a larger increase in behaviors before and during. The school-wide testing schedule is a very stressful time because we call it no movement mode. So that just the environment during testing is we don't have the bells on. So students, in order to not disrupt. So in order to create that testing environment, we have to basically be on full lockdown. So students end up being in testing locations for hours up to lunch because of the extra time. So if you have a test that's 60 minutes long and they get the extra time, now it's 120 minutes long. The students are not required to use that extra time. And like Sarah said, we're not even allowed to encourage them to use the extra time once the test begins. In the script, there is a part of it that says you have extra time, use it to your best advantage. Prior to that new rule where we're not even allowed to tell them to go back and check, I would just make a general statement and say, this extra time is provided for you to, let you kind of take that stress away about the times. What I find is students prefer not to use that time. They just want it to be over. They don't want to sit there for 120 minutes. And the ones that actually do, I've noticed that because they're in a room of students that basically either bubble in on their writing book or enter their answers quickly into the computer and put their heads down, the ones that actually do want to continue feel like, oh man, I'm holding up this whole class. And even the students that are the most studious and they can do well, they see around, okay, everybody's done. I don't want to be the last one doing this. So they just want to quit. So then there's also the students that are not testing during the schedule. That would be our 11th and 12th graders if they've already taken all their tests. So what we've done is the 11th and 12th graders have to go to, I guess in bigger schools you call it an overflow room. What we do is we have them go into some of the elective rooms so that they can be working on stuff. So we have a music class, we have an art class, we have a PE class. So we funnel the 11th and 12th graders into those classes where they're basically just sitting and waiting for this standardized testing to be over. So they're not able to work on their IEP goals. They're not receiving their services. Many of the therapists become test proctors, so they're not receiving therapy. So, in their own minds, and they've asked me, do I even have to come today, Ms. Jaramillo? Because I'm just going to be sitting there all day long. And so we've made allowances for some of those students who have an excused absence. But again, then they're not in their room learning. They're not based on their IEP goals. So again, it's a waste of time for them. And with all of the teachers teaching to this test and utilizing so much time just to teach to the test, prepare for the test, it is a lot of wasted time that could be used better for students to be working on their individual education plan goals. Right before testing, I get many, many parent calls, concerns. Some of the parents even, choked up and saying, my child, she can't sleep, she can't eat, and she knows if she doesn't take this test, she's not going to graduate. So I, as a counselor, I'm not only counseling students, I'm counseling parents, and I'm trying to help them feel more confident, but I'm not actually allowed to say, don't worry, it can be waived. It's a very tough place to be because I have to follow the law, but I also have a heart, I'm a human being and I want to support these students and parents, but we're limited in exactly what we can do as far as that. So lots of parent concerns right before testing. Okay, so I researched some of the barriers to success. I've got to move my window screen because I'm hiding it. Okay, so, it talks about can you guys see my text screen? Am I covering up my slides? Can you see my camera pictures? Am I covering up my slides? Okay.
No,
Okay,
it's you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So I went on to, I did a lot of Google searches to try to get some of the, best information. And so I found one called fairtest.org, and it all was linked to standardized testing for students with disabilities. And one of the things I quoted this because it's very important. One of the barriers is that students with disabilities are not always exposed to all the materials on the test, because many of them are behind grade level. You know, they have to have those basic skills to be able to achieve their next level. Special education law says the students must be in the least restrictive environment. However, many students do not meet those benchmarks to be in a lesser restrictive environment. In my setting, we're the most restrictive environment. For a student to enter my school as an EBD student, they come with boxes and boxes of files of interventions. It takes a lot of meetings and interventions. They start with the gen ed, they have to go through the RTI process. They have to go through 6 weeks of interventions. And you know, it takes a lot for a student to be enrolled in my school. And because they're all, many of them, you know, behind grade level, they're not always, you know, up to speed on what's going to be on the test, because they have to, you know, get some of those basic fundamental skills before they can proceed. So when they're in the most restrictive environment, the most restrictive environment, they're not always receiving, you know, before testing, they're receiving as much as they possibly can. But during testing and in preparation for testing, they have to be exposed to material they have not even had the ability to have success in the classroom. And here we are putting a legal standardized test that says you aren't going anywhere unless you pass this. And we find that to be very unfair to students that are already dealing with gaps in learning, you know, lower scores. And now we're asking them to take the same test as their gen ed peers with the same rules and the same repercussions. And I find that that creates so much more stress for the students and their families. So as far as collecting data, I collected my own data based on the families that I serve in my school. But I also found this, and it really speaks to the exact percentages pretty much that I was given as far as my poll. So there was a poll that was conducted by the Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development at the Sylvan Learning Center. And it was called State Mandated Educational Assessments Survey of Parent Perceptions. And what they were showing is that the parents are very confused about these standardized tests. They wonder, why is my child, who has been through so much and is working on their own personal goals, which is what the IEP is for, why are they being given these tests? How is this an accurate measure of what they've learned and what they've achieved in their classrooms? Parents, I don't know a single parent that is in agreement that this is a good idea and that their student should be taking this test, should be held accountable, and should have to have the same repercussions as gen ed students. Not one parent has that feeling, at least at my school. And in the research I found that is, you know, countrywide, they do not agree that these standardized tests should have the same weight as they do on the gen ed. I don't think that they think testing is good for gen ed either, but they're speaking on behalf of their students with disabilities. So Secretary Education, I don't know if you can see this. And I know this is outdated because, you know, we had Betsy DeVos and we've had others, but this I felt was a very good quote, is that, you know, he called for caution for states to make a mid-course review of their testing programs to ensure that high stakes testing do not result in inaccurate measurements, excessive student stress, and a narrowed curriculum. Students need to be challenged, not traumatized. And that is what I feel, and the people that I have spoken with feel, that it is a form of trauma on these students. My students come from low economic backgrounds, mental illness. All my students who come to my school have a diagnosed mental illness. Some of it being bipolar, schizophrenia, depression, some of them with personality disorders, antisocial personality disorders that can create severe, violent behaviors. So our students, to put this test in front of them, I feel is just cruel. I really do. That's my personal opinion, and the people that I've spoken to, you know, they've shared that with me. The students, the teachers, the parents have that same feeling. How do I make this child who may have just been Baker acted last week, and now I'm going to put this test in front of him? What is that doing to this student? Not just academically, but emotionally. Where's their self-esteem? I feel that this is not only unfair, but I feel that it is very detrimental to these students to have to take and pass these tests. Okay, so I quoted, in looking at recommendations, I took this right from the AFT website. AFT resolution against standardized assessments for students receiving special education services. These are direct quotes from that page. And I gotta say, this was the one page I felt, you get it, you understand it. So the direct quotes are excellent. In many cases, standardized assessments do not accurately measure the progress of students with special needs because these students are often not performing at grade level or have disabilities that inhibit their ability to complete standardized assessments in the same manner as their non-disabled peers. Standardized testing has a particularly harmful impact on the frustration level and emotional states of students with special needs, which can result in negative views of school and learning for students who are already struggling. The misuse and overuse of standardized testing undermines educational quality, teaching to the test, and quantity, multiple weeks, months per year devoted to testing. And those are facts. I was so happy to find this because, again, it speaks volumes. It speaks to me personally, and I witnessed exactly this in my setting with students with disabilities. So the recommendations, they're actually pretty simple, and many people have expressed exactly this. Require the states and district to use multiple measures of student performance. Require if tests are used, they're valid and reliable. Measure what the students are taught. So we have students that are pursuing a standard high school diploma. And then we also have two classes of students that have more severe cognitive disabilities. So they're on alternate standards and they're on the standard access diploma. In the past, they used to call it a special diploma. That changed a few years back, and it's now called a standard access diploma. So all of the same requirements are there. They're just assessed on access points instead of the typical standards. So those students do have an alternate assessment called the FSAA, Florida Standard Alternative Assessment. And that's given in a much different way where it's teacher-led, it's one-to-one. They use the access points and they measure success based on an interactive test that they do with their teacher. And we find that they're in the same biology, US history, it's in all of the same subjects, but it's much more fair, if you will, and the student doesn't feel as much of the anxiety because they're coached and they're not given the answers, but they're provided that individualized support. So we find that's one thing that I find as a recommendation is to use something more like that, even with the students that are pursuing a standard diploma. And use teacher-created tests to measure learning gains. Growing up, I grew up in Broward County. I'm a product of Broward County Public Schools. We never had to take these tests. I remember the Iowa Achievement Test and the California Achievement Test. I remember CAT testing. And I remember that was a time of stress when we were younger and we had to go sharpen all our pencils. But our teachers were able to make it seem positive. And this isn't, this is just to see what you know, do your best. And it wasn't something that we knew, okay, I'm in fourth. I will not make it to fifth if I don't pass this. So that stress, obviously years ago, was not put onto us. When I look at students now, I think, you know what, if I was a high school student, I couldn't graduate. If I had to pass this FSA and take it over and over and over until I pass it, I don't know how successful I would be. And the other was to use report cards of evidence of student progress. The teacher in the classroom is the one that knows the student best, knows their skills, knows their deficits, and knows how to reach those students. I feel it's unfair to basically take that teacher autonomy away, take that teacher's professionalism away, their integrity, because they can accurately report what the students' abilities are, and they can see where the gaps are and how to reach them. By just putting a standardized test in front of these students, I feel it takes away the teacher's respect, because they don't have enough integrity to truly measure the students' abilities. That's tough. That's a tough one to take. One other thing, and I don't believe, okay, so there's my references. One other thing that I didn't include is that as you know, in the ESE population, when the students, one of the accommodations that are given, especially on the writing test, is that the student can either dictate to a staff member, and the staff member will write out their writing prompt, or they are allowed to write, but because of their handwriting, some of them, you know, we have to type up the responses and send that in. So that's the only time we're allowed to see the writing prompt or the student response. And I can tell you, there have been writing prompts that have brought me to tears. I had a fourth grader one year, and he was writing, this was back around the time of Hurricane Katrina, and he wrote some of the most offensive remarks in his test about, and I don't even want to go there because I don't want to say what was said, but he was focused more on the hurricane and the damage, and you know, he was scared about what could happen to him, and he wrote all of this stuff in his test. I've also had students where they will just literally write curse words all over the test. We have to send it back just like that. In the manual, it says erase stray remarks. Well, when I've got a complete just curse word all over the test, I can't erase all of that. So, as in my opinion, with administration's approval, I'm sending this back as it is. And the way I feel is, you want to test my EBD students, here's what you're going to get. And to the point, this was such an issue for me that about 15 years ago, I went and spoke at a school board meeting because I wanted to share my passion about the danger and the you know, the trauma that this provides to students. And I gave my 3-minute speech, and I spoke about that we're over testing. This was when it was still FCAT. And one of the board members at the time said, well, this is all the state. And Robin Bartleman, our wonderful board member, who's now a state representative, she had tears in her eyes as I spoke. And the one comment she made is, well, that Broward assessment test is not statewide, because we used to do those BAT testings the beginning of the year when the students first return, and then again in like December. Those tests were not as punitive because it was just to gauge, you know, how they may do on the standardized test and what more skills they need. So as much as that was helpful, because it's just year-long testing after testing after testing, she actually recognized and agreed with me and said, you know, this is, I believe Frank Till was the superintendent at the time, and she says, we don't need to be giving this test. And so, you know, nothing changed at the time, but what I love is that the bats were removed several years ago. So anyway, like I said, this is a very personal issue of mine that I have a lot of passion for. And I just want to see our students, the ESE students, to be given that fair opportunity to truly show what they know without all of that extra pressure on the standardized test model. So that's my story. I appreciate everybody's time and listening. I hope I didn't go over too much time, but I again, thank you very much.
Thanks, Alicia. You need to stop sharing.
Try. Oh, stop share. Okay.
No, I'm just letting you know that would be next. Very, very informative details. I really do appreciate that EBD setting. That was always one of my mysteries that I don't think I'll ever solve. My first year of teaching, I had a child that was EBD in my class, and I didn't know. I mean, he was brilliant, did everything. I never saw anything. And then one day a chair went flying past my head, and I was like, oh, that must be the EBD, because the inability to control emotions, the not being able to put their words together and their actions. But I can't imagine a whole school filled with children that are having struggles with their emotions, and then they're being given a high stress situation. Excellent. Questions, comments, support, love? Janae said, great presentation. She's learned a lot.